Hello, it's me. Really? Whatever Elon Musk says, AI hasn't taken over politics yet. For the moment, it's still down to we humans to solve the problems we create. The great fear is that the Israel-Hamas conflict could spread. Hezbollah holds back from launching a second front, but for how long? And what could happen next? Here, pro-Palestine marches continue. 29 people were arrested yesterday amid some disturbing scenes. The Home Secretary is worried about Armistice Day. And this week, the King's speech. Rishi Sunak says a lot can be achieved in a year before the next election, but can these plans really save the Conservatives from electoral disaster? Oliver Dowden is the Deputy Prime Minister and in charge of the Cabinet Office. We'll get the latest on Britain's trying to get out of Gaza and what will be in Tuesday's King's speech. John Healey is Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary. We'll try to work out just how serious is the row in Labour over Gaza and calls or not for a ceasefire. On Friday, the leader of Hezbollah said it wouldn't escalate its conflict with Israel yet. So we'll speak to the Lebanese ambassador to the UK and try to find out if the war in Gaza could spread. Plus, Suella Braverman has spoken exclusively to Sky News.
Living in a tent has become a lifestyle choice, and with it has brought drug use, criminality, and antisocial behaviour.
We'll bring you the Home Secretary's views on immigration, pro-Palestinian marches, and those words on homelessness that has sparked a furious row. And with us throughout the morning, three independent-minded insiders: the broadcaster, presenter and journalist Andrew Marr, the columnist and former Conservative Party advisor Lord Finkelstein, and Dorothy Byrne, who used to run Channel 4 News and is now president of Murray Edwards College, Cambridge. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. If the news from the Middle East itself isn't grim enough, we hear this morning from two of the world's most influential money men, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan and Larry Fink of BlackRock, that the world faces the biggest economic crisis since 1938. If you plan to go to work by train, there's a threat by activists to bring mayhem to mainline stations. And let's not forget, there is still a war going on in Europe that has caused tens of thousands of deaths and over 500,000 casualties. Never mind, cheer up. We're only a few days away from the King's speech and the autumn statement, and we had just the man with us this morning to explain how it's all going to be better. A little earlier, I spoke to Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden. Deputy Prime Minister, can I first ask you about the headline in the front page of the Mail on Sunday, which alleges that, and I'm quoting here, the Tory party covered up for serial rapist MP. What's your response to that allegation?
Well, first of all, any allegation of sexual misconduct I take extremely seriously, and the Conservative Party has zero tolerance for sexual misconduct. We have an independent complaints mechanism, and that investigates any allegations. The Mail on Sunday, as far as I can tell, doesn't contain any details of the persons involved, so there's a limit to what I can say further than that. Other than say it may be the case that these matters are subject to an ongoing criminal investigation. So to reassure you, we take any allegations exceptionally seriously.
This is not a party political point, but of course there appears to the casual eye to be quite a lot of this in Parliament at the moment, and irrespective of party. Is there something wrong about our Parliament?
No, I don't think there's something wrong about our Parliament, and the vast majority, and I think this is important to reassure, you may know this, Trevor, but to reassure your viewers, that the vast majority of people in Parliament are there to serve their constituents and to serve the nation. Now, in respect of a very small number of cases, it's important that robust action is taken. And indeed, if there are allegations, I would urge anyone to go straight to the police. These are criminal matters and they should be investigated properly.
All right. Let's turn, as always, I like to start with what we know about the fate of British nationals trapped in the war zone in the Middle East. You understand that nearly 200 British names were added to the list of those permitted to leave Gaza over the last couple of days. Do we know how many are now safe in Egypt?
Well, it's over 100 British nationals who have now crossed through to through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. Obviously, it was disappointing that the crossing closed yesterday, meaning that we couldn't get more out. But we are making representations at every level to secure the reopening of the crossing, and I'm hopeful we will achieve that today.
Have you any idea when it might reopen?
Well, I'm hopeful that we will have success today, but we are continuing to make representations on that front at every level. It's essential that we do get British nationals out. We have made progress with over 100, and I hope we can make further progress.
We've seen the bombing of sites in Gaza, which the Israeli Defense Force had said ought to be safe, that they wanted to avoid. But have you asked the Israelis to create some safe corridors for our people to find their way down to that crossing from the north and from the middle sections of Gaza?
Well, both the UK government and the US government is engaging intensively with the Israelis. You saw Secretary of State Blinken has been out there very recently. Our Prime Minister spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu last week. And in all those conversations, we restate the need for Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. We also make the case for temporary pauses to allow humanitarian aid in and to allow people out and people to move. So we don't believe that there should be a full ceasefire for the reasons.
Are you getting
much
response out of them for that? Because people are stuck.
Yes, we are having constructive engagement with the Israelis. The one thing I would say, though, is that we do also have to understand the situation that Israel finds itself in. This appalling massacre, a terrorist attack of over 1,000 of its citizens, means that Israel does need to take action to remove this Hamas threat. And that is in the context where Hamas hides itself amongst the civilian population. So it's not an easy situation. We understand the difficulty the Israelis have, but at the same time, we are urging humanitarian relief in that way.
OK, the conflict there is rather spilling over here. Tens of thousands marched in support of Palestinians in London and other cities. Here in London, there were 4 police officers injured. There were fireworks thrown into the crowd. We saw videos of tube carriages essentially being taken over by demonstrators. And some of the scenes were, I think, probably pretty intimidating, especially if you are Jewish. Are you happy with the job that the police are doing, keeping our streets free for people who aren't involved in this and don't want to be involved in it?
Well, I understand that the police have a very difficult job to do against this backdrop of protest. But I do have concerns, and I see this in the community that I represent. I represent a large Jewish community. That community are fearful right now, and we shouldn't see this just as a matter for the Jewish community. We should see this as a matter for all of British society. It is not acceptable to our British values that there should be that kind of intimidation. And I have to say to you, I'm a bit disappointed that if you look at the moral indignation and the clarity that we saw after the murder of George Floyd in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement, we haven't seen across civic society the same kind of moral clarity showing that Jewish lives matter. And I think that is a cause of hurt to the Jewish community, and it is something that disappoints me as well. And I see it whether it's on our campuses or elsewhere. We need to send a very clear signal that Jewish people are safe in this country, not just for the sake of Jewish people, but for the sake of British society.
That's quite a statement, Deputy Prime Minister. Are you saying that you think that there is essentially a fundamental problem in this society's attitude towards Jews, in the now famous phrase, Jews don't count, in the way that maybe some other minorities do?
Well, I think people need to understand that anti-Semitism is racism, full stop. And the same abhorrence that we show to other forms of racism, we should show towards anti-Semitism. And I think that if I look at what happens, for example, on campuses, and I'm talking about real-life examples of constituents of mine and their families, there are children who do not feel safe on campus. Now, that is not an acceptable state of affairs. Equally, it's not an acceptable state of affairs where Jewish people don't feel safe on the streets of this country because of intimidation. Now, the police should take very robust action on that, but all of society
Is your feeling that they're not doing what they should be doing?
I think the police are working exceptionally hard in relation to this, and indeed I've engaged with the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, as has the Home Secretary. I don't doubt the difficulty of this. What I would urge is a redoubling of efforts, and I would particularly look at this march that's happening potentially in London next Sunday.
On Armistice Day?
Yes, and I think that at a time when it's meant to be solemn remembrance of the sacrifice of previous generations and upholding our British values, I think that the police need to think very carefully about the safety of that demonstration, namely whether it could spill into violent protest and the signal that it sends particularly to the Jewish community. Now, I understand the Met Commissioner continues to keep it under review, and I think that is appropriate.
Are you sending a clear signal to the police that, in truth, you think, on balance, that march on Armistice Day, the Saturday, not the Sunday, Remembrance Day, that you think that march should be banned?
Well, the police are operationally independent, but I do have very grave concerns about that march, both in terms of how it sits with acts of solemn remembrance and the kind of intimidation that is being sent out by the chants and everything else that goes on at those marches. Now, I think it's right that it's a law of the land, that the police are operationally independent. I think it's important that they consider those factors. Yes.
It would be a bit of an irony, though, that 2 hours after we mark the sacrifice that people have made for freedom of expression, to then say you can't have a march, however disagreeable.
Well, we have robust freedom of expression. Indeed, there were marches and demonstrations last weekend, the weekend before, the weekend before that. This is the weekend, or next weekend will be the weekend where we mark a very solemn moment in our nation's history.
All right, let's talk about the Home Secretary. Mrs. Braverman, talking about these marches, she calls them hate marches. I've actually been on some of these because they go past the studio here. And there are undoubtedly, as you say, political extremists. There are groups that split off and do things that are really unpleasant in the tubes. But most of the people that are on these marches are young students and families, as far as I've seen anyway. You would not really dream of using the phrase hate marches about these groups of people, would you?
Well, I think there is a lot of hate in those marches. So when you have people chanting jihad, jihad, or from the river to the sea, that is intended to send intimidation. And that is the concern that I have, and I believe that the Home Secretary has with them.
But isn't the problem that if you start characterising the whole of these marches, people who, frankly, are not in the category that you've just mentioned, and I've seen them, and, you know, they're very unpleasant things, even I would feel intimidated by, but most of the people in these are not what you would call hateful people. My colleague Ali Fortescue yesterday asked the Home Secretary whether she meant that everyone on these marches was hateful. And I just want to make this point. Mrs. Braverman could have said no to that, but she refused to do so 3 times. Look at this exchange.
Do you think everyone on these marches is hateful, as you put it?
I think, as I say, if you've seen images of hundreds of people chanting jihad, being corralled to do so...
Everyone, even on the fringes of these marches, is hateful.
Chanting from the river to the sea.
We've spoken to lots of people who weren't there supporting Hamas, who were there supporting Palestinian people. You think those people are hateful?
I think everybody's entitled to freely express their views.
The problem here is, isn't it, that what you say may be right about some people, a minority, as you said yourself. Isn't the danger here of this language that actually the great mass of people who probably want to be in the same place as you do now find themselves described as hateful? Isn't this the height of irresponsibility?
Well, I understand people's legitimate concerns about the plight of the Palestinian people. By the way, those people who have suffered so much under Hamas. That's why we're providing aid to support Palestinians. That's why we, for example, we forward deployed that aid. What I would say is to those people who are on the marches in support of the Palestinian cause, they should also just think about the people that they are standing alongside. And just, I would like to see more clear calling out of this kind of thing, because the danger is they inadvertently lend a legitimacy to some more extremism that we've seen in those marches.
All right, let's move on to something else that the Home Secretary said. She tweeted yesterday about homeless people that we cannot allow our streets to be taken over by rows of tents occupied by people, many of them from abroad, living on the streets as a lifestyle choice. Now, let's just take for a small example. Some of the people in those tents are our veterans. Is that the way that we should be talking about people who've risked their lives for this country?
Well, I don't want to have a single person rough sleeping on our streets.
No, but I'm talking about the language that's used about the homeless people on the streets.
This is an important point of context to this, and indeed, this is one phrase you took from I think it was a series of tweets, or X's, I suppose you say now.
Yeah.
So we don't want a single rough sleeper on the streets. We've committed to stopping that. We've put money where our mouth is, with over £2 billion over the next 3 years. We are making progress with reducing the numbers by about a third. Now, we have to address both the push factors, and push factors include drug and alcohol addiction, the experience of veterans. Indeed, I would say in respect of veterans, there's fewer than people might say.
That in what Suella Braverman tweeted.
Actually, if you look at what she said, she did talk about addressing push factors as well. But at the same time, if we can be in the position where we've removed all of those push factors, then I do think the tents and other things that we see on our streets are not acceptable if we've got somewhere else for those people to
Deputy
go.
Prime Minister, none of that nuance is in Suella Braverman's tweet. Your own colleagues in Tory Reform Group, I'm looking here, they've tweeted, the UK streets are not being taken over by tents. We are not San Francisco. These are ill-thought-out policies which divide. My point is that the important things you've just said are never going to be heard as long as the Home Secretary uses this kind of language.
Well, first of all, I would say look at all of her tweets. I believe there was a series of 4. I took the time to read them before I came on, and she made those points. I think it's right that we deal with both the factors that drive people onto the streets, and that's why we're dealing with drug and alcohol addiction and so on, over £2 billion. At the same time, we should have an ultimate reserve power as a government to say that people can't have these kind of tent encampments. And I believe that's what she was saying in those remarks.
You've got the King's speech on Tuesday, and this is very interesting. You've got this directive that's coming on tents and so on. You're also going to tell local councils that they may not vote to boycott Israel. Now, again, this may be a policy that's disagreeable to many people, including yourself, but is it your business to tell elected representatives of local communities what to do?
Yes, I think this is a very important piece of legislation, and we have a clear principle in this country, which is that it's for the national government to determine foreign policy. We don't need to have local authorities making foreign policy statements, which essentially they are in respect of, for example, in respect of West Bank boycotts and so on. But there's another point.
They're just deciding who they want to do business with.
There's another point in respect to this, which is that it does send a signal, and it's a divisive signal. And I know that it causes hurt amongst the Jewish community in this country. It's not necessary. If people have worries about our foreign policy, it's resolved through democratic elections to the place you have behind you, to our House of Commons.
OK, last point. All of this telling people that they can't smoke, telling people what decisions their local councils shouldn't make, all of that, it's not very Tory, is it? I mean, Rishi Sunak's administration turns out to be one of the bossiest ever.
I don't agree with that characterisation. Actually, I would challenge you back the other way, which is there any person who's got young children today who wants their child to grow up smoking? I think that's what we're seeking to address through that legislation.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our panel makes of all that. With us through the show are three independent-minded expert insiders: broadcaster and journalist Andrew Marr, columnist and former Conservative Party advisor Lord Finkelstein, and Dorothy Byrne, who used to run Channel 4 News, is now president of Murray Edwards College, Cambridge. Danny, I was quite taken aback by the strength of Oliver Dowden's expression, if I can put it that way, of Jewish hurt and fears.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously listened to his constituents. That is how the Jewish community feels about it. Certainly, it's how I feel about it. I do think that legitimate points about government policy can be made both politically and through protest marches. It is quite sort of burdensome to Jewish people to find the central London and lots of mainline stations taken over week after week with people, large proportions of which are asking to drive half of the Jewish population in the world into the sea. It's just... And you do wonder to yourself, how sensible would it be for me or for my children to go into central London in these circumstances? Whether that feeling is justified or not is a different matter. You know, and you've witnessed people. I don't suppose that the vast proportion of those people are personally threatening or intimidating, and they're trying to make their political point. And if I don't like it, I have to suck it up. But I do think that sort of scale of demonstration. Basically, we've got a tension. People have got a right to demonstrate and to make their point. That's political protest. But there are lots of other things that go on in life. You know, even in Liverpool Street Station, one of the things that goes on in life, people want to get trains, and they're also entitled to do that. That's also a civil liberty.
Dorothy, this is it's provided a big challenge, hasn't it, really, to civic society and particularly to the police. Who has to make judgments about this kind of thing?
Well, I think Oliver Dowden was saying that there should be robust action by the police, and I think everybody would be in agreement with that. I've been repelled by a number of the things that I've heard, and I think that the people who said them should be arrested, that there is absolutely no place for anti-Semitism.
What do we mean by that? For example, are you talking about from the river to the sea and all that kind of thing?
I think some people who say that don't really know and understand quite what they mean. I'm thinking about some actual anti-Semitic things that have been said that I would not wish to repeat here, and those people should have been arrested, and we've seen buildings attacked, and I certainly never thought in my lifetime that I would see that, and my Jewish friends have told me that they feel genuinely afraid, and that's absolutely appalling, and action should be taken.
And Andrew, there's a balance to be struck here, though, isn't there?
Up to a point, not really. I mean, you've got a panel here to disagree with each other, Trevor, and I fear you're not going to achieve that on this particular subject, because I would say more of my friends are Jewish than not, for whatever reason, and I know lots of people at the moment who will not go into the centre of London at the weekend because they feel intimidated and they feel afraid. And there was, Dorothy's absolutely right, there was outright despicable anti-Semitism on placards and in chants at one of the rallies that I've seen, and those people should be arrested and prosecuted, because people of my generation, if there was one moral thing that we knew about and that we were brought up with, it was the Holocaust, and that never again. And now we're seeing anti-Semitism again on the streets of London, and there is absolutely no excuse, and there should be no hiding place for the people doing it.
Are you saying, Andrew, that people you know just won't come into central London?
Yes, absolutely. I was walking in a street by myself. Somebody who lives around the corner, he said, well, I've said to the kids, I've said to the family, we won't go into central London at the moment at weekends while these rallies are going on. And we feel intimidated.
Oh, for sure. I mean, for sure, that is the view.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, to anyone who's listening who thinks to themselves, well, look, I'm sympathetic to the thrust of, you know, the Israelis shouldn't be doing particular things in Gaza. I may have a difference of opinion with you, but that's a different matter. It's a different matter from having a placard with the Star of David in a bin and saying, keep the world
clean.
The world clean, You know, that is just a different... And it's because of that Jews do find this very intimidating.
Let me be honest and say that I'm not at all disturbed about the fact that there is no disagreement on this particular point. I think nobody in their right minds is going to argue the case about that we shouldn't just exercise freedom of expression just to exercise it. We also have to think about how things are heard and felt by other people. Which brings me to Suella Braverman. Dorothy Byrne, are her comments helping?
Does anything that Suella Braverman says ever help anybody? For her to imply that all those people who went on marches because they really cared about Palestinian people are part of hate marches. They're not. Those people are really caring people, and to imply that they're not is adding to the divisions in our society when it is her job as a politician to be helping to bring us together at what is a challenging time for everybody. But I also feel that this country has an ability to take an international matter of great importance and end up with just talking about Britain and disagreements in Britain, when we should actually be concentrating on what is happening in other countries. And she has, in my view, postured throughout these matters.
So Mrs. Braverman is not here to defend herself, so let me gallantly step in to try...
Good luck.
to try to do that. Look, I mean, Oliver Dowden made the point that actually, and he was pretty clear that he doesn't think that the cops are doing the job that they should be doing, and that they're allowing things to happen on the streets, the sort of things that you've just been talking about. Surely she's the Home Secretary. Surely she's got a job here to say, actually, some things have to be dialed down. They've got to be stopped.
Dialed down. But you started this show, Trevor, by saying that Suella Braverman has sparked a furious backlash. Suella Braverman gets up every single day and thinks, now, what furious backlash can I spark today?
Exactly.
How am I going to do it? I had Saida...
Well, she obviously succeeded.
Exactly. And again, I had Saida Varsi, the Conservative peer on my show on LBC this week, who described her as an arsonist. And verbally, I can see what she means. I mean, what is going on in Gaza is literally intolerable and appalling and horrific. And, you know, tens of thousands of people believe that, and tens of thousands of people want to come out and express that. And to call all of those people a hate march is, in itself, ridiculous and incendiary.
Well, I find myself in an odd position often with Suella Braverman, which is that so, for example, her feeling that we cannot have completely open borders and that we haven't tackled that problem successfully, I agree with. Obviously, I'm sympathetic to the broad thrust of her point that she's concerned about the policing of the marches and concerned about some of the people that are on the marches. And I'm actually even on the homelessness question, which maybe we'll discuss later. I am of the view that she's not wrong in thinking that the right solution is to provide people with alternatives to being on the street, rather than allowing the creation of tent cities. All of those things, and I think those are things that are right for a Conservative Home Secretary to talk to. And sometimes people are shocked that a Conservative Home Secretary will be a Tory. But I always feel that she uses unnecessary language. I'd love one week for her to have to come on the Sunday programmes and defend Oliver Dowden's emollients. Rather than having... And I think a lot of these things, they lose arguments that Conservatives should be winning. And I find that very frustrating. And I also agree with Dorothy very strongly. They also create more division when the job, particularly of a Home Secretary, but of all political leaders, is to try to create greater national unity, even in the process of expressing strong opinions of their own.
All right, we will return to some of that, and particularly homelessness point, but it is coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Deputy Prime Minister has said he's disappointed that we haven't seen the same kind of moral clarity in showing that Jewish lives matter as was shown in Black Lives Matter campaigns. Oliver Dowden told this programme he hoped that the Rafah border crossing would reopen today and that some 100 Britons have left Gaza so far. Still to come on the programme, in just a moment, I'll speak to the Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, about the increasingly bitter row inside Labour over the situation in Gaza. And with the very real worry that the conflict could escalate into the wider region, I'll be joined here by the Lebanese ambassador to the UK, Rami Mortada. And we'll bring you that exclusive Sky News interview with Suella Braverman as the Home Secretary talks migration, homelessness, and the pro-Palestinian protests. Now, this week, Keir Starmer again tried to heal the increasingly bitter divides in Labour over the party's policy towards Gaza. The Labour leader has resisted demands from many in the party to call for a ceasefire. Instead, he says there should be a humanitarian pause. Now, I can speak to the Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey. Good morning, Mr. Healey.
Good morning.
The American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, called for a humanitarian pause yesterday, something for which your leaders also called. Can you tell me what exactly is the practical difference between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire?
Yes, a ceasefire, and this was Keir's argument in the week that you talked about, that a ceasefire freezes a conflict. In this case, it would leave Hamas fighters, weapon systems, command centres in place, and it would leave them in place and able to mount similar terror attacks that we saw on October the 7th. And his argument is also that for the aims that we all want to achieve, which is a reduction in civilian casualties, more aid getting into Gaza, the chance for hostages to come out, and more space to see further diplomacy, it's humanitarian pauses or breaks in fighting that are most likely to be, as Martin Griffiths, the UN aid chief, has said, the most viable option. And I think we must all welcome the indication from the Israeli Defence Force today that there may be a 4-hour break in fighting, a humanitarian pause, if you like, to allow people to move more safely south and away from the main part of fighting in Gaza.
So the essential difference between the humanitarian pause and the ceasefire is that the humanitarian pause is one-sided, that it's basically what the Israelis do, but Hamas doesn't have to observe it.
No, it's a break in fighting that allows some of the things that we all want to see, especially the alleviation of Palestinian suffering, to take place. And in the end, what matters is what stands the best chance of working. And in a conflict like this, small steps can lead to bigger breakthroughs. So that's why Keir Starmer's been arguing for humanitarian pauses. Keir Starmer is not a protest leader. He understands why people are calling for a ceasefire, but he believes that for those two reasons, for now, that is not the right approach.
As you know, I'm not much of a pedant, but I wanted to ask the difference here, because there are a lot of people in your party who do think it's that there is a big difference. We've heard from Anna Sarwar, Scottish leader, Andy Burnham, Sadiq Khan, 200 Labour councillors who signed a letter complaining about your leader's words. Two council leaders called on him to resign because they think you should use the word ceasefire because it is actually something different. Are you going to at all bend on this one? Are you going to pay any attention to what they're saying?
No, Keir Starmer set out the arguments. He wants to bring people with him like a good leader, the sort of leadership we've not seen from Rishi Sunak on this. But in order to respect the absolute right that Israel has to defend itself, rescue its hostages, and take out Hamas fighters and threat for the future, and especially to try and achieve the relief of the suffering, the greater aid into Gaza, the break in the humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing within Gaza, then pursuing pauses or humanitarian pauses or breaks in the fighting is the most practical way of doing this. And Keir Starmer will be looking to win those arguments, take the party with us.
We've heard that, Mr. Healey, but let me put the words reportedly of your own Scottish leader to you. he said that Sakir's comments lacked, I'm quoting here, humanity and empathy, and that there would need to be a repair job with Muslim voters. Do you understand how deeply this is being felt by some of your most loyal voters?
I do, and many people, not just those in Muslim communities, are horrified and heartbroken by the images that we've seen from Gaza. But the biggest imperative...
They would say you're simply ignoring that, actually.
No, not ignoring, but Keir Starmer and we are arguing that there is, in these circumstances, at this point, a better way, a more practical way, and that is to try and achieve breaks in the fighting that allow some of the relief of the suffering. And in the longer run, Keir Starmer in his speech also pointed the way in the future where ceasefire may become possible, where the hostages are out, the ability of Hamas to be able to attack Israel again in the future has been degraded. Circumstances in the future that may allow us to achieve the ceasefire that we'll all want to see. The question at the moment is, for now, what is the best, what is the most practical, what is the most realistic way of getting some of the aid in to Gaza, some of the relief for the Palestinians, and a reduction in the innocent Palestinian casualties that are at the heart of our concern about this fight.
How do you respond to your critics within the party who simply say, we've heard all that, but actually what's happening here is that you've made a cynical calculation that you can afford to lose quite a lot of Muslim votes, that won't cost you any seats, but you need to show that you've shed the taint of anti-Semitism?
I utterly reject that. The starting point is the fundamental principle that any nation, ours or Israel or any other nation, has to defend itself when it comes under such a catastrophic, horrific terrorist attack. And to safeguard that right, you must uphold the scope for Israel to pursue those Hamas terrorists in Gaza. They must meet their duties under international law in doing so. And meanwhile, whatever can be done, and this is why the United States, the European Union, as well as Labour and the UK government have all been arguing that in these circumstances, a humanitarian pause is the most practical way of getting any sort of relief in the conflict.
OK, can I move on to what is happening here? I've spoken this morning to Deputy Prime Minister about the demonstrations on streets of London and other cities, police officers injured, chanting on the tube, and so on. There's a question being raised about whether the march that is planned for next Saturday, Armistice Day, should go ahead. And the Deputy Prime Minister gave, I think, as clear a signal as he could, that he would rather it didn't go ahead, that it was banned. What's your feeling about that?
This is a difficult balance, isn't it? In a democracy like ours, the right of free speech and protest is fundamental. But there has to be a respect for the remembrance service, for all cenotaphs and memorials, for the 2-minute silence on Saturday, not just the remembrance parade on Sunday. That must be protected. And I hope the police, and it'll be an operational decision for them, will be able to work with the the Palestinian protest march organisers, as the indications seem to suggest, that the march will be at a later time, in a different place in London, so that any sort of conflict which would be utterly unacceptable doesn't arise.
But if the police decided that they didn't want it to go ahead, the Labour Party would not be upset by this?
Well, if the police decided they didn't want it to go ahead under what is the 1986 legislation, it would be for the Home Secretary to take that decision. I hope that won't be necessary. I believe it should be possible to manage both the proper respect and the conduct of the remembrance parade around the cenotaph, and allow the protesters concerned about what's going on in Gaza and the loss of Palestinian lives to undertake their protest at a different time in a different part of London. OK, John Healey, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Thank you.
Back to our panel now. Andrew Marr, Danny Finkelstein and Dorothy Byrne. This is rather awkward for the Labour Party still, isn't it, Andrew?
It is genuinely difficult. I mean, this argument that you made that they can ignore Muslim votes, I'm not so sure about that. There's some big arguments about the numbers. If it turns out there is some well-organised attempt to put up independents against Labour MPs or Labour candidates who haven't said the right thing, then I think that could cost them some seats. And in a tight election, that could matter a great deal. So Keir Starmer has to balance all of that against his own policy. He cannot change position now. He would be absolutely destroyed as a leader if he suddenly folded and said, OK, I've listened to you, I'm going to go for ceasefire instead. And I think actually his point has been strengthened by what that Hamas leader said last week about confirming that he wanted the annihilation of Israel and that they would be carrying on further versions of the October 7th attacks again and again and again. So I think, he's probably, from his point of view, in the right position, but he has to work very hard inside the party to keep people from going further. He doesn't want to lose people from the front bench, is the main thing.
Danny Finkelstein, I'm rationing mentions of your podcast to no more than 3 in this programme. So here's the first. How to Win an Election, your podcast with Peter Mandelson and Polly McKenzie. Is what's happening in Labour now an example of how to lose an election?
Well, it could be. Actually, I think Keir Starmer's taken the right stance electorally. Obviously, the main thing he's got to do is take the right stance morally and and show that he can be a prime minister. And I think he's actually done that with the stances he's taken. That would be my view. It was very interesting to watch that interview. There's a fundamental difference, as you pointed out, to John Healey, and as he was, trying to, as it were, soften between a ceasefire and a humanitarian pause, and that is, do you believe the action to degrade or destroy Hamas is the right thing to do, given that lots of civilians will unquestionably die in the process? And that's a horrendous calculation for anybody to make. But Labour has picked. And I think the thing about Labour, it's a little bit obviously about the Muslim votes, but it's also about defence policy, which has split the Labour Party, just like Europe split the Conservative Party, or imperial trade has split the Conservative Party over and over again. And this, is a split over deterrence and it's a split over alignment, and you can see that.
Dorothy, do you think they'll be able to hold the line?
Well, I think they will have to hold the line. But one of the points that was made by Labour's Scotland leader was that Keir Starmer had lacked, I think the phrase was humanity and empathy. And I think in the way that he spoke initially, he did probably lack the humanity and empathy that he could have shown. So if he cannot move from where he is, he has, it's a year maybe before an election, I don't know. It's about showing that you have real sympathy in a way that has not been shown. Lots of the people in the Labour Party who believe that a ceasefire is impossible actually feel in many, many ways the same as the people who believe in a ceasefire. They are absolutely appalled by what is happening. And also, when it's said they must meet their duties under international law, there is a real issue. Are they doing that? Can they do that with their current policies? So the two groups are more aligned than they seem to be.
I think the crucial thing is for Labour to start to lay out a distinctive policy about the whole Middle Eastern issue. The really, really big bubbling thing that worries me a lot is what's going on in the West Bank at the moment. And I think Starmer should be talking about that. I think he should be talking to the Palestinian Authority, and I think he should be talking to the Israeli opposition parties with whom Labour is more aligned. In other words, when it comes to a ceasefire, let's be absolutely honest about this. There is nobody in the Middle East, not Hamas, not the IDF, not the Israeli government, who's going to listen to the Labour Party's view on ceasefire or pause. It is a completely semantic argument as far as the people actually on the ground are concerned. But it is possible, I think, to start to lay out a policy for the beginning of peace talks when this is all over, and to talk about the West Bank and all of that.
Danny, do you think actually, there are people who sort of dismiss a ceasefire demand, but I think the important question is it actually realistic? Because ceasefire involves two sides, and is it? Yeah. Can you see circumstances in which that could actually take place?
It'll only take place at the point where Israel feels that it has degraded Hamas sufficiently that it's not a threat, because there was a ceasefire on October the 6th. Having a
You mean a ceasefire before October the 7th?
Yes,
happened?
exactly. And it's not always humanitarian, however disastrous war is and however many innocent people die, to have ceasefires, as we discovered in the Second World War, when we decided that we would only accept the unconditional surrender of the Nazis. So, in my view, what Keir Starmer was doing may not have been something that we listened to, but we can all hear whether somebody who wants to be Prime Minister believes that always humanitarian to have ceasefires.
All right, just after this break, what you've all been waiting for, we'll hear from Suella Braverman. The Home Secretary has been speaking exclusively to Sky News.
Living in a tent has become a lifestyle choice, and with it has brought drug use, criminality, and antisocial behaviour.
I'm Inzamam Rashid, and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Suella Braverman rarely shies away from stoking controversy. Her latest comments have done just that. Yesterday, the Home Secretary said living on the streets was a lifestyle choice. Now, speaking exclusively to Sky News after visiting a migrant camp on Samos in Greece, she says there's no need for anyone to live in a tent on Britain's streets. And after describing pro-Palestinian protests as hate marches, she warned anyone who vandalises a cenotaph that they'll be locked up before they know it. She was speaking to Sky's Ali Fortescue, who asked if she would block plans for an Armistice Day protest.
Well, I don't want to undermine the process that is very clearly set out in Section 13 of the Public Order Act. It's up to the police to initiate an application, and they must do that within their operational discretion, their operational independence. And if they do that, I will consider it on the merits that they present.
But to be clear, you don't think it should go ahead?
I think I've been pretty clear that these are hate marches. They are, I think chanting of jihad on the streets of Britain in the 21st century is utterly despicable. And I don't see how any decent person or how the vast majority of the British people can find that to be acceptable behaviour. It's sickening.
You call them hate marches. Do you think everyone on these marches is hateful, as you put it?
I think, as I say, if you've seen images of hundreds of people chanting jihad, being corralled to do so,
everyone, even on the fringes of these marches,
flags,
is hateful.
Chanting from the river to the sea, which is a call to arms used by terrorists, celebrating the largest single loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, glorifying acts of terrorism. I don't think there's any other way but to call them hate marches.
There are concerns that the cenotaph could be targeted on Armistice Day. What action should be taken if that happens?
Listen, Armistice Day is a day that is of profound national significance in Britain. It represents our moment of collective mourning and remembrance and reverence, and it must be treated with the solemnity with which it deserves. If anyone were to vandalise the cenotaph, they must be put into a jail cell faster than their feet can touch the ground.
Mark Rowley says that the police need more powers to deal with protests. Will you look at giving him those powers?
Sir Mark has made some comments about his concerns that he has. We keep our laws under constant review, and if there is a need to change the law, I won't hesitate to act.
Have you ever been on a demonstration yourself?
That's a very good question. I haven't, no.
Let's talk about reports that you're planning on restricting homeless people from using tents. Why is that something you're looking at?
Listen, the British people are a compassionate nation, and of course we must do everything necessary to support those who are genuinely homeless. But at the same time, we must make sure that we don't go down the same route as some cities in the US, like San Francisco or Seattle, where living in a tent has become a lifestyle choice, and with it has brought drug use, criminality, and antisocial behaviour.
You talk about a lifestyle choice. I mean, surely this is something that people do out of desperation, not out of choice.
Well, as I said, we will help those who are genuinely homeless. It cannot be right that parts of our cities are ruined and blighted by the sight and use of tents. There is no need to use tents for accommodation in 21st century Britain.
And while we have a bit of time sitting down with you, I want to ask about the kind of person, I guess, behind the public profile, because you're seen really as the most controversial cabinet minister. Is that a position that you relish, that you enjoy?
Listen, I'm here as Home Secretary to deliver for the British people on some incredibly important issues: securing our borders, stopping the boats. And personal attacks will always come with the territory with this job. I've got a thick skin. I'm focused on delivering for the British people.
How do you think that pledge is going to stop the boats? Where do you think you're at?
I think we're making progress, but there is more to do. The numbers of illegal arrivals this year so far are down by about 30%.
Where would you like the numbers to be by the election?
Well, as I said, we've promised to stop the boats. It's pretty clear what that means, and we'll do whatever it takes to deliver.
Are we talking, you know, tens of thousands or hundreds? Just if you could
I'm not going to give a specific number.
We're judging you on your terms here, and you haven't done anything like stop the boats, and you won't even tell us what that will actually look like. Why should people trust you?
I'm not claiming success at all by any means yet. All I'm saying, and I'm being pretty straightforward, we have made progress, but there is a lot more to do, and it will be pretty obvious whether we've succeeded or not.
Well, let's see what our panel thinks. I'm still with Andrew Marr, Danny Finkelstein and Dorothy Byrne. Dorothy, pretty much always in politics there's somebody who effortlessly attracts attention, and Suella Braverman appears to be the magnet of this government. What is it about her?
It's not effortless, it's effortful. This is a person who wakes up every day and looks at world events, whatever they are, however tragic they are, and thinks, how can I turn these tragic world events towards something of benefit to Suella Braverman, bringing attention to Suella Braverman? I find it morally repulsive.
Can I unleash a secret at this point?
Oh, God.
A closely guarded secret.
I've got the lawyers in my ear. Carry on.
Suella Braverman is running to be the next leader of the Conservative Party after they lose the election. That is what is going on.
Breaking news.
There is always somebody on the right.
Run the ticker.
Exactly. Ted Heath had Enoch Powell. David Cameron had Nigel Farage. Rishi Sunak has Suella Braverman. She is inside the tent, but quite where she's aiming is unclear, I would say.
We do end up having discussions about the language she's using and then not about the argument she's making. So we're diverted from the question of whether it's a good idea or not for people to have tents in London
That is partly
cities.
the point, Danny, I think. That is partly the point.
She made that speech where she ended up saying something that I found very difficult and disagree with, that multiculturalism doesn't work, when having said a number of things that I did think were worth saying about whether the international system was writing a cheque on refugees that it wasn't willing to cash. In other words, that it had a system that it actually couldn't live by because of the numbers of people that were that it would allow to go from one place to another. And we never had a serious debate about any of the serious things that she's saying. And maybe it is the point. She often says things that are quite intelligent, challenging, and not everything that she says is wrong, but then puts into it, for example, using the phrase lifestyle choice, which my reaction is the same as yours. I find that very difficult, unpleasant language and unnecessary. But do I think that a reasonable argument to be had about whether or not the right thing is for people to live on the streets when there are alternatives to it? Well, that's a different matter.
But Danny, it's you earlier on made the argument that essentially, let's put it this way, she was always 90% of the way to something worthwhile, and then this other 10% gets chucked in, and that's what we all get focus on, and we forget the other 90%. Let's talk substance, because that's the kind of programme we are. She does represent something in the Conservative tribe, doesn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and also the points that she's making, they're worthwhile all of us discussing. So there's an awful lot of evidence that suggested that when, for example, in New York, they begun to say that what called squeegee pests, the people who were wiping your windscreen at traffic lights, that was unnecessary and aggressive, and people found it difficult. Lots of people hated that whole thrust, liberal people, and they immediately had the same reaction I did, but should you do that? And it was the right thing to do. So we should have a discussion about whether she's right about the tense, not just a question of her language.
Is there a danger, Andrew, for the left and the centre-left, that Suella Braverman is doing a very clever thing, which is to suck everybody into talking about her and how awful she is and all that stuff, whilst actually elevating the agenda she wants elevated, it's immigration and so on, and out in the country, there'll be, people nodding and going, well, maybe she's this or that, but she's got a point.
She has the dog whistle out. I mean, is it clever is the question. Has she actually advanced the arguments and things she's talking about very much, or are we all just talking about her and her language? I'm not sure that is shrewd politics from her point of view. Right. I mean, if you've got the 90%, which is good, why spoil it with the 10% which isn't? In other words, don't you lose the 90%?
I'm not so sure about this 90% that's good.
Well,
sorry.
I'm only quoting the boss.
For me, she is distracting from the failure.
Yeah.
All these problems are very difficult problems, and the Conservative government has not solved them. So my view is, yes, we shouldn't be talking about Suella Braverman. We should be talking about, are we solving the major problems that our country is facing? And we're not.
Well, indeed. Doris, let's talk about that, because it struck me that this is a really quite peculiar King's speech from a Conservative administration, because a lot of it is very directive. A lot of it is about telling people what to do and what not to do. And I said to Oliver Dowden, this is a bossy government. But it is quite bossy, isn't it?
What strikes me mainly about it is how it's not about the really big things that the people I know are talking about and bothered about. I really care a lot about getting rid of smoking. My father died of smoking. I care about leaseholders. I care about those things, but I care about the economy, particularly
You'd vote
the
for this King's speech, then?
NHS. Sorry?
You'd vote for this King's speech then?
Well, I'd vote for the bit about smoking, but it's not about the great big issues facing our
King's
country.
speeches generally aren't. I mean, what's really been very interesting to me, going into the Lords, watching the legislative programme, often it's completely out of sync with political preoccupations or indeed even big political themes. And that's because legislation often deals with small issues where the law needs changing. It's different.
We will come back to big politics in part 4. In just a moment, I'm going to speak to Lebanon's ambassador to the UK, Rami Mortada.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. On Friday, the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said, "This front may lead to a broader war. This is a possibility, and the enemy must keep that in mind." The group, prescribed by the UK government as terrorists, is an important part of the fabric of Lebanon as a political party, social and civil movement, and a military force that calls for the destruction of Israel. But it is not the same as the state of Lebanon. The country has faced economic problems in recent years, accompanied by ongoing political instability, made worse by the growing conflict in Israel and Gaza. I'm joined now by the Lebanese ambassador to the UK, Rami Mortada. Good morning, Mr. Mortada.
Good morning, Sir Trevor.
Now, you're the representative of the Lebanese government itself. But the head of Hezbollah, as I said, spoke on Friday about this rising conflict. What can you tell us about this situation there today?
Well, as you know, the situation is tense and volatile at our southern borders. There is low to mid-intensity exchange of fire. From our side, as Lebanese government, we are doing our utmost to contain the situation and not to allow the country to be embroiled in a larger conflict. But this, of course, necessitates curbing Israeli provocations, which we've been sustaining for the last 3 weeks, and finding a horizon for this horrific conflict in Gaza. You know, this conflict is very contagious, and it's so difficult to contain it in its original theater of operation. The social fabric in the whole region is similar. So this propagation effect is natural. Again, from our side as Lebanese government, we don't want the country to be embroiled into this deadly conflict, but this necessitates cooperation from all stakeholders.
Let me ask you about a specific thing. I want to come back to more general politics in a moment, but earlier this week, one Amnesty International official alleged that Israel had used white phosphorus shells, which are banned by international conventions. And the allegation is that Israel had fired these into southern Lebanon. To the knowledge of the Lebanese government, is that true?
Yes, it's documented, and we reported that to the United Nations Security Council, requesting it to take action against Israel. And this is not the first time that Israel uses internationally banned arms against Lebanese territory.
Well, Israel, of course, has said that it had never done that and would never do this.
This is documented by UN reports. I want to remind you that we have UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, UNIFIL, which have been doing an excellent job for years. And their successive reports, they confirm this illegal use of weaponry by the Israeli side, along with targeting civilians and targeting journalists. 3 weeks ago, there is a journalist that was slain by Israeli shelling, a reporter, photographer, and 5 were injured, along with other civilians that were killed by Israeli shelling.
Okay, Lebanon has, for a long time, I came to Lebanon many years ago, and even then it was a battleground fought over by people from outside Lebanon. You talked about Israel, but also there is Hezbollah. Now, Mr. Nasrallah seemed to be saying on Friday that they have no plans to escalate hostilities. Do you believe him?
I think no one has plans to escalate. This conflict has taken everyone by surprise. Everyone in Lebanon understands the seriousness of embarking in an armed conflict. However, we have been on the receiving end. Israel started provoking Lebanese territories 3 weeks ago. And what you're seeing from the Lebanese side is defensive and aims at recalibrating the cost-profit equation for the Israelis with the aim of maintaining security, not embarking in an armed conflict.
When you say recalibrating the cost-profit equation for the Israelis. What do you mean by that?
Well, they should know that for every action, they would expect a reaction. This is a natural, I think, rule of how things go in this region and beyond. I think this is a universal rule.
So by that logic, if the Israelis don't, for example, simply stop their activities now, we could see more aggressive action from Hezbollah.
Defensive, you mean? Defensive. I think Sayyid Nasrallah, he
when we call it
emphasized...
aggressive or defensive, what we mean is more rockets being fired into Israel.
He emphasized in his speech, and of course I don't speak for him, he has spokesperson, but as Lebanese government, and they're part of the Lebanese society, I would tell you that the Lebanese action, or what you've been seeing from the Lebanese side, is purely defensive. Now, having said this, there is also the other... Yes, they're purely defensive. Actually, we've always been on the receiving end in Lebanon. We've never started a war.
To be fair, I mean, I understand why you're saying that, and to emphasize again, you do not speak for Hezbollah, I accept that, but it is part of Hezbollah's purpose in life. They are completely clear about this, that they want to destroy Israel.
Well, it's their strategic objective, but in action, they've been in the defensive now for decades. Anyway, I'm not here to defend their modus operandi or to explain their modus operandi. They have their mode of action.
I get that. I understand.
But from a Lebanese government standpoint, I reiterate that we're not interested in escalation. We just want to curb Israeli provocations, which have been very tense on Lebanon recently. And at the same time, and in parallel, it's a fact of life. It's a statement of fact, not a statement of preference, if you want.
I mean, the reason... So I'm not talking about Hezbollah simply to put you in that position, but the thing that I think is very striking here, everybody in the Middle East a generation ago would have said, Lebanon, what a beautiful country, it's a place where different kinds of people meet and so forth. Over the last generation, it has pretty much been destroyed by this conflict, and the economy is virtually collapsed and so on. The problem that you have, I guess, is that you've asked, for example, for more aid from Britain, but as you yourself have said, Hezbollah is part of Lebanese society. It operates schools, hospitals, bin collections, and you can't get aid from Britain while you're essentially in the grip of this organisation that Britain defines as a terrorist body. How are you ever going to get out of that situation?
Well, I think this approach is totally counterproductive, because if you want to contain any group, you would need to empower the state. So aid aims at empowering the state, at making sure that the Lebanese state becomes the main refuge for the citizens. And any logic that goes counter to that would indirectly serve any group that you originally want to contain.
So your answer is to strengthen the Lebanese state?
Definitely, the Lebanese state, the Lebanese army, and that's what the UK has been doing, and we always ask for more.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Since Brexit, we've had to do an awful lot of red tape to get the paperwork in place to be able to bring the animals over here. It's not an easy thing. In terms of transport, it's fairly simple. You just, to arrange the vehicles and the crates and things. And then, of course, you've got to be able to try and crate train the animals so that they can go in safely without the use of sedation. So there's an awful lot to do, but paperwork is the one thing that's holding us back a bit. If they go online onto the Yorkshire Wildlife Foundation, they can donate, and that will help to raise funds to go towards them. We have the funds in place to be able to bring these animals to Yorkshire. but anything extra will help for their upkeep and their care, and help with the transport that goes with it. Mum was in Donetsk, and of course the war broke out, and the owner fled because that region was being heavily bombed. So she was basically abandoned. She was then taken to Kyiv, where she gave birth to the 3 cubs. And then from there, she was taken to Poland because obviously Kyiv is in a war zone too. So she was then taken to Poland. And in the zoo there, they are looking after the cubs and mum. But we really need to try and get them over to Yorkshire as soon as we can, because we want them to have a really nice big space. Unfortunately, in Poland, they although they do have fantastic facilities, they don't really have the space because the cubs are currently living next door to tigers. If we can get them over to Yorkshire, we can give them the space, and they can live a long and happy life without any risk of war, hopefully. But we are hoping to get them here for Christmas. Because of Brexit, you have to sort paperwork out for every country that you travel through. So because we're going by road all the way across Europe, each country that we pass through will have to give their clearance and health checks and veterinary sign-offs. So it's basically all the paperwork that has to be arranged in conjunction with each other. That's the most difficult part, really. And we are waiting for Poland to complete their side of things.
Back to our panel now. Andrew Marr, Lord Finkelstein and Dorothy Byrne. While we've been on air, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has essentially whacked one of his own junior ministers, slapped him down, because this person said, I haven't got the exact words in front of me, something like, it is possible that they might be able or have to use atomic weapons in Gaza. We're in a very strange country now, aren't we?
So this is a very, very extreme government, Netanyahu's government, with some very strange people inside it. I mean, clearly the answer is no, it is not possible. If only because of the fact that the wind...
Netanyahu's been very clear about that, to be absolutely stone cold on it.
But there are people on both sides saying mad things, and the rest of us have to kind of live in the gap between them. I think the Netanyahu government doesn't have very long left of its life, and I think he has brought people into the government, including supporters of some of the more extreme West Bank Palestinian settlers who are, should not be in any government at all.
Dorothy?
I completely agree. This is telling us that there were people in that government who should never have been near the government of any country, and it shows you just what an appalling leader he has been.
Danny, I'm always reluctant to get into long discussion on this programme about language because I think, it's usually about something else. But it seems to me what we've been hearing a lot this morning is that what people say and the way they say it is very important and can mask the actual substance of what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Netanyahu's strategy, which was let's suppress all Palestinian aspiration, it's better for Hamas to lead in places rather than Fatah. We can rely entirely on our security,
which was the dominant faction in the PLO
Bank
before,
and is in the West Bank, and that you can do that. You can do that forever and keep Israel secure. As all I've always thought that was wrong, both morally and strategically, and now it has been exposed as being wrong. So clearly one element in getting peace will be destroying Hamas, but the other element will be the Israeli government being willing to negotiate about a two-state solution. I've always thought that was the only solution. Netanyahu's been moving away from that. And at the end, we cannot have peace after this without them doing that. So, I think you're right. I think he's right that his strategy has taken this big hit with what's happened, because it shows why it was wrong, the strategy.
I just want to come back to you, Danny, on something that you've actually tweeted out in the last 24 hours, I think. We were talking earlier on about the impact of what was going on out there here, and you tweeted this. Explain.
Well, Alfred Weiner, who created this Holocaust library, was my grandfather. I've just written a book about him and my family. And Alfred, who was not himself actually a Zionist, he was in fact an Arabic scholar, an Islamic scholar. He created an archive of everything the Nazis did. It was used in the Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trials. It's in Russell Square, and somebody saw fit to put the word Gaza. Toby Simpson, the director, has brilliantly archived this sign in the archive.
Oh, that's going in. That's actually going in the museum.
That's how what they've decided to deal with it. They're going to have a new sign. They've taken this one down, and they had to tape this off with the screwdriver, which my aunt had to do when the Nazis invaded Holland, and they had the library's sign had to be taken off the.
I just want to talk about. I mean, this is coming onto our streets in a very big way. Our team, Chelsea, meets Spurs tomorrow, and that's in this context. That's quite an electric. That's an electric meeting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's an issue about banners and so on.
Absolutely. There's the use of the Y word in which David Baddiel, the comedian and writer and thinker, has campaigned against, has created situations at games where there's been quite a lot of anti-Semitism. It's been quite uncomfortable to be Jewish. And then there's always been this issue of what signs do you allow in games? Is it acceptable in a Liverpool match to have Palestinian flags, or in a Celtic match to have Palestinian flags, or in a Spurs match where they've often used the mug in David?
The Star of David.
To what extent does the Star of David a flag, and to what extent is it a religious symbol? And if it's a religious symbol, why does it belong to these people who most of whom aren't Jews? So there are lots of complicated issues.
This is going to be with us for a while.
Exactly.
Let's talk about politics. There will one day be an election. Political editor of the New Statesman. Let's have a look at where Mr. Sunak is after his first year, which happened about a couple of weeks ago. Do you think Rishi Sunak has been a good, great PM and all of that? That's his numbers last year. His numbers now look like this. I think they're going to turn up. Well, if they don't turn up, I'll tell you what they are.
Tell everyone they're a lot worse.
Here we go.
I thought maybe Rishi was actually working the ultimate.
I think somebody's been trying to suppress this, but actually, down to 11%, average 30%. Poor half people think he's been a poor, terrible prime minister. Curtains, right?
Probably, yes. There's a year to go, and a year is a very, very long time. Lots of things can go on in a year. Very interesting story, Trevor, in the Sunday Times today. They didn't put it on the front page. I can't understand why, which is a couple of very, very senior financial players in the United States think as a result of the Gaza war, we are heading for the worst recession since 1938.
Yeah,
and things are going to get much...
Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink.
Exactly. And things are going to get much, much worse. So we have no idea really what the atmosphere in the country will be when people finally go to the poll. There are people inside Danny's party talking about leaving it until January 2025, which would mean putting us through a Christmas election, which I think would be curtains for anybody. But nonetheless, the way you look at the numbers, and I don't really see much of a way back for the Tories.
Dorothy, people will have to listen to Danny's podcast, How to Win an Election, second mention, to his view. If you were advising Danny to advise the Prime Minister, what would you say? How could they win this?
They can't. And actually, that poll there was before he interviewed Musk. So you would have to add an extra category, ludicrous PM, and then that would be like 80%.
I mean...
So, funnily enough, I disagree with that for two reasons. One is no one will know about that because the public doesn't know about it. But secondly, the AI summit was actually quite successful. And weirdly, if you ask me the question what I would do, I would do more things that Rishi Sunak think work, hoping that to some extent they do and make life better. I don't think they're going to win in the election. The driver of these figures is that the things that people care about, mainly the economy, has just got worse.
Well, Dorothy's point earlier on was that the government seems to be talking about everything other than what people actually care about.
So that is the absolute crucial thing. So I slightly disagree with Danny about the AI thing. Nobody did notice it, you're quite right. At the softball interview with Musk was very much Rishi Sunak in his tech bro mode, hanging out with the guys from California. And he didn't, by the way, ask him about anti-Semitism, which he certainly should have done, and he didn't ask him about the degradation of what used to be Twitter, which he should have done. Nonetheless, he's not talking about what the rest of us talk about.
Let's stick with the Prime Minister for the moment. Here is what people said about him. Out of touch, charismatic, weak, incompetent, not racist. I think that's quite bizarre. Only 60% think he's not racist, which is... The country is set against him, isn't it?
Well, set against the Tories.
Danny and then Dorothy.
No, I mean, it's just set against the Tories. We've had a massive cost of living crisis. The Conservative government's been in for a very long period of time. And if you ask the question to the three of us, none of us have answered what should he do about the situation. I don't think there's anything he can do because he's waiting for the economy to improve and it's very difficult for him to control that.
Dorothy, is it all over?
I know what he should do. He should just go now and give the next lot a chance.
All right. We're going to talk about this. A quick reminder, best way to set you up for the political week ahead. After watching us, of course, listen to our great new podcast with our own deputy political editor, Sam Coates, and Politico's UK editor, Jack Blanchard. That's Politics at Jack and Sam's, every Sunday, wherever you get your podcasts. And that is it for us this week. Sunday morning, Trevor Phillips. Thank you, all three of you. And by the way, if you want more politics, great politics, you can catch it on the Politics Hub every evening from tomorrow to Thursday with Sophie, 7 p.m. on Sky News. Thanks. See you next week.